thanks for coming down and chatting with me, and looking forward to this. So recently in Portland, Oregon, there was an incident when a racist maniac got on the MAX train, actually right up here, and evidently started threatening, I haven't seen the footage, but evidently started threatening two young women, one of whom had a hijab. And I wanted to talk about that more broadly and what people would do if they found themselves in a situation, what should they do? So that's why I want to have this conversation. So could you briefly go through the incident?
Well, two men were killed. So there was someone on the train, and it appears he was harassing these young women. Three men confronted the man that was harassing the women, and he pulled out a knife. Right. The man that was harassing the woman stabbed them. One survived and two are dead. So it's a tragedy. And I think the big points that I'd like to talk about when it comes to that is there's really about 3 or 4. And the first one is I don't take too seriously people who say I would have done this or I would not have done that.
I want to talk about that.
Yeah, and I don't judge too harshly how anyone reacts in that kind of situation, because unless they're used to that kind of very high pressure violent situation on a fairly regular basis, people don't really know how they're going to react. If you take a non-selected sample of people and you put them in a circumstance like that, some people will freeze up, some people will want to just flee, and some people will, charge and do that.
Yet it really is interesting. I want you to get to the other points, but it really is interesting how people have this certainty. Oh, I know I would do this, and I would stand and that's one of the reasons I want to have the conversation. I think that's unbelievably immature.
Well, it's immature, but in many cases, I'm sure it comes from a good place. They want to stand up for the women that were being harassed, and we all want to think of ourselves as being capable of being the hero. But I guess my point behind that is you never really know until you're in that circumstance. So that's one thing. The second thing is people who haven't engaged in the topic before, haven't trained with weapons before, don't understand usually just how dangerous knives are. Right. Knives are incredibly dangerous. Right. And there was the 21-foot rule, which was
surviving edge weapons.
Yeah, Dennis Tuller from Salt Lake City, but he had the 21-foot rule, but actually it's been revised since then, and for most people it's closer to 30 feet. And what that means is before you can draw a weapon and fire and hit your attacker, you will be stabbed if somebody's charging you with a knife. And all of the people in the organization who train law enforcement and military in guns and knives, which we do, will tell you that in a close quarter situation, if you're within a few feet, they'd all prefer a knife. So knives are incredibly dangerous. Right. People don't realize that. And you see that when these incidents come up with officer shootings and they say, well, he just had a knife. Why do you have to shoot? Why not use a taser? They just have no idea.
Right. So I had that question that I asked you a while ago about a video. Right. And I think it's really important to explain to people, why not just a taser? Because that was my first thought too. Why do you have to shoot the guy? Why can't you just tase him?
Right. Well, you can miss with the taser, and both points have to hit, and it creates the connection. They could be wearing a jacket. They could be moving very quickly, and if you don't, the point of shooting the other person isn't to kill them. The point of shooting the other person is to stop them. Right. And if you don't stop them, and they are within arm's reach of you, and they have a knife, they can kill you.
Right. Now, you sent me a video. Mm-hmm. Of a guy who's tased, who's walking around trying to kill the officers. Right. Let's post a link to that because I do think that's part of the.
Yeah, he's walking around.
Yeah.
Just continue. There's another incident that a lot of people probably have seen of a family domestic dispute. I think it took place in a parking lot somewhere. And the police showed up and they wound up hitting one of the guys with a taser, and these guys are drop and roll to pull the tongs out, and they continue battling, and they wound up having to shoot and kill one of them. Right. And they knew the officers were wearing vests, and so they were clawing at the face and the ears, and these are people that know what they're doing.
Yeah, and a lot of that comes from, and I know this is not your specialty, but my thinking is, it comes from watching way too many movies. Of like one guy taking knives out of the hands of 10 assailants with bats and chains, and they're just fantasy-based silliness.
People who don't have experience with firearms don't understand. I mean, I was engaged in a conversation with a guy overseas who said, well, why don't they just shoot him in the leg? I have no idea. Well, because number one, shooting somebody in the leg, you can still kill them. There's a lot of arteries.
Right.
But number two, it's a lot. You know how hard it is to shoot a moving limb as compared to a torch. To be able to stop someone in a situation where somebody has a knife and they're trying to kill you, potentially try to kill you, and they're within just a few feet of you, and you need to stop them. You're going to now aim for their arm or their leg.
Yeah, or I hear shoot the gun out of their hand.
Yes.
I mean, come on.
Yeah.
Okay, so back to the train thing. That was the first point, and you had a couple more.
The first point is, be mindful of saying, well, I would do this or I would do that if you've never been in those kind of situations. And as we talk about this, I want to talk about it in the context of lessons we can learn from it, not in the context of judging people for how they did or what they did or did not do in that circumstance. Second thing is how dangerous knives are. The third thing is when you're dealing with somebody who's probably mentally ill, as it appears, I think it's pretty obvious this guy was, and we have quite a few. You'll see a lot of people who are clearly mentally ill walking around Portland, in the homeless population.
Some up here, right where we are.
Yes, some right where we're at, and they often say very threatening and violent things, and some of them have a record of violence, and the police know who they are, but it's very difficult. It's a difficult situation if they're not immediately presenting a threat to themselves or someone else. You can't force them to take medication, and they're out there, and people need to understand that when you come into contact with someone like that, the rules change a little bit. You can't engage with them in the same way you would somebody who is rational. You know, you can threaten someone who's rational. You can use deterrence with someone who's rational in a way that you can't somebody that's mentally ill, because they're seeing things and hearing things that we're not. And you're not going to be able to engage with them in exactly the same way.
That's such an important point.
It's an important point to remember, and I think that's a big part of probably what happened on the train. And then the last thing I'd like to talk about is, there's been a kind of a vulgar trend that's gone around Portland where people have used this tragedy, which is what it is, because it's politically convenient to make political talking points. And whether they realize it or not, they are washing their hands in the blood of the dead when they do that. And I find it disgusting.
Explain that.
Well, you're taking a tragedy where people have died, and you're immediately, and this happened almost instantly as soon as they heard that this guy was talking to two women who were apparently, he thought, were Muslim. Because of the words that came out of his mouth, it became a way to attack Donald Trump. And of course, I'm no fan of Donald Trump, right?
Nor am I.
But if you really think about what that means and what people are doing, it's a way to wash away their own, perhaps maybe white guilt in the blood of two men who died. And it's very, very distasteful. And I don't think, a lot of the people who do it don't mean it that way. I don't think they even recognize what they're doing. But you want to be a little more careful with incidents like this and really break it down and see what happened, because confronting someone who's mentally ill. Yeah,
that was the third point. I wanted to talk about that.
Especially in a situation where they're boxed in. So you're in a train. Let me put it this way. It wouldn't surprise me if the guy who stabbed these three people, and killed two of them, if he winds up getting off on a self-defense charge. Self-defense.
Why?
Well, I'll explain that in a minute. And will probably get sent to a mental health facility, which is, I'm sure, where he belonged in the first place.
Absolutely.
But we have to be careful when these kind of situations come up and not just immediately jump on it, because it's politically convenient for what we already believe. So, especially when people have died.
Yeah. So I think the third point about someone who has mental illness. So here we are. We're sitting on a train, and I want to at some point talk about. It depends who the we is. You're sitting on a train might be different from, or even me when I was 20 or what have you, might be different. So there's someone who's doing something horrible on a train, but he's not actually physically injuring anybody. He's certainly screaming and freaking out at people. So, excuse me. So the goal in that situation, and correct me if I'm wrong, would be to attempt to de-escalate it if you did anything, and the worst case scenario would be to escalate the situation.
Yeah, you don't want to escalate the situation. Let me give you two examples. Okay. There's a homeless person that sits just over here by the academy, behind what used to be the burger bar, and I see him every once in a while there, and he sits on the bench there, and anytime a family walks by, so it could be a woman with kids, it could be a man with kids, a couple with kids, I've walked by with my kids before, he begins screaming, "Child molester. You fuck kids, child molester." Just starts screaming it out as loud as he can, right?
Oh my gosh.
Now,
I mean,
that's a horrible thing to say. I guess we could argue which was worse, what the guy said on the train or this guy. But it's bad, and you're sitting there with your kids. My kids are 3 and 7. They don't even know what that means. And
I know. I'm thinking of me walking by with my 11-year-old Chinese daughter.
That doesn't mean I can turn around now and confront him on the park bench. And it doesn't mean that the appropriate response for me is to get in his face on a park bench and start lecturing him, because it's obvious to me he's mentally ill.
Absolutely.
And he's not on his medication. There's another guy at the same MAX station where this happened here in Hollywood that screams at women on a fairly regular basis. I've had several customers, and my wife have come in here. I'll tell you one more story. One time I was downtown Portland. My wife was pregnant at the time, and she was just walking around shopping over by the library, and this guy came over to her and started saying very vulgar things to her, and how he wanted to have sex with her and this kind of stuff. And she told him to walk away and get away from her, and he started screaming at her, "Whore, slut," this, like at the top of his lungs, right? So she gets in the car and rolls the windows up, and she's waiting for me because I was going to meet her there. And the guy leaves and he crosses the street, and I get in the car. She's in the driver's side still, and I'm in the passenger seat. And she explains to me what just happened. Of course, I'm angry. Yeah. And we roll the windows down because it's hot. And here comes the guy, not knowing that I'm in the car, to her window, leans down and starts screaming at her. So of course, I lost my temper, jumped out of the car, chased him. I'm not very fast. He was a lot faster than me, it turns out. He runs into the library, screaming and that, I'm being chased, and runs in there. But I got about, halfway up the stairs there in the library, and I stopped and I realized, hang on a second, what's going on here? I mean, it's awful that he said that, and yeah, he probably definitely needs to learn a lesson at some point. But this is a guy who's a mental patient.
Exactly.
Who's walking around downtown, and had I, confronted him and grabbed him, and I laid hands on him, I would be the one then that would be probably looking at being arrested and potentially going to jail. And it doesn't matter if what he said was politically horrible. Right. If my wife happened to be black and he started saying something racist to her, it still doesn't mean I get to put my hands on him.
Right. That's a key. That's
a really important point that a lot of people seem to be forgetting with the whole punch a Nazi thing and everything else. People can say horrible things to other people, but that doesn't mean that, not only does it mean that you can put your hands on them, it doesn't mean it's a good idea.
So you used a phrase that I want to unpack, because it's just something I hear so much. Teach a lesson. If somebody has mental illness, like the guy by the burger bar over there, saying that you're a pedophile, there's no there's no like, I'm going to teach this guy. There's no teaching. No, he has mental illness.
Yes, exactly. And the first thing people did was jump on this guy and say he was alt-right, neo-Nazi, and must be Donald Trump's fault. And in a closer inspection of his Facebook page, inspection of his Facebook page, he, apparently he was a Bernie Sanders supporter, but I'm sure he's not a Bernie Sanders supporter. He had all kinds of weird stuff.
He has mental illness.
He has mental illness, and he was talking about all kinds of things. So what happened, I think, on the train was he was harassing these young women. And I have not seen the footage, but there is footage, and from the reports and the law enforcement that's seen the footage, he was harassing these young women. They got up and moved. He did not pursue them, so now they're on a different part of the train. Right. And then 3 men confronted him, one of which was the poetry student. Shoving ensued, so it escalated, and he pulled out a knife and stabbed them. Now, in court, theoretically, he's on a train, he can't get away, he's confronted 3-1, there's a disparity of force. He says he was in fear for his life. Right. Is it possible he walks away with a self-defense? It's possible. Am I saying that he was the victim here? No. Am I saying that this violence in any way, shape, or form was justified, or it should have ever come to that? Of course not. But this is what happens in these kind of situations. So the moment that he moved away from those young women, he should have been left alone. They should keep the women safe. You want to keep yourself safe. Everybody on the train needs to stay away from the crazy guy who might be armed, and in this case was, and then get off the train as soon as those doors open, as soon as you can. But confronting him, getting in his face, was probably not the best idea. And again, I want to go back to point 1 that I prefaced this statement with. I'm not judging people in advance, because you don't know how you're going to react in that situation. I could have been in that train.
You mean you're not judging the guys?
Yeah, because you could have lost your temper and been like, why is this guy talking to that woman?
So I want to talk about that. So you and I have rolled many times.
Yeah.
I've seen you rolled.
Yeah.
You, if I may be blunt, you are absolutely not a man to be trifled with, and that's independent of your size. So now, you are on that train. You see the same thing. What would you, now the initial thing, not when he walks away, what would you have done?
I would like to think that I would have stayed close to the young women and away from him, and that I would have been able to keep my emotions, I would have been strong enough to check my emotions and my anger at this man,
Right.
and mature enough to recognize that he was mentally ill and that there needed to be some distance. You know, whenever it comes to any kind of self-defense situation, my acronym is always MIND. Maturity, intelligence, notice what's going on around you, and then you get to the D part, and this is where we get into actual physical things. But if the maturity and the intelligence and the noticing part had been at a high enough level, I like to think that I would recognize this is someone who's mentally unstable. He's screaming horrible things, but just like this guy that calls everybody a child molester on the street,
Right.
you know, he's a mental patient. Right. We just need to keep everybody away from him.
Right. So even you, with a lifetime of being a professional martial artist, coach, international thing, a whole thing.
Let me answer it in an even shorter sentence.
Yeah.
Him with a knife, me losing my temper and getting emotional, getting in his face, he could have easily killed me just as he
Right.
killed those men.
Right.
Knives are extraordinarily dangerous, and whether you're a black belt in jiu-jitsu or an MMA fighter or whatever you are,
Yeah.
if you make one mistake with somebody with a knife, you can die.
Yeah.
It's
So
extremely dangerous situation.
So it's interesting when I hear you say that and have an awareness of it, and yet there are so many. Your legs aren't tired from sitting like that for so long.
Occasionally.
Yeah. That there are so many people who just jump to this conclusion. Oh, I would have done this.
Yeah.
Or I would have leapt up and
Yeah.
chopped them. And
Yeah.
and I just think that that's so.
Here's a general rule, right?
It's
The
just-
more
it's
somebody,
just-
the more assured someone sees in how they'd respond in a violent situation, the less experience they probably have.
Oh, yeah,
The
right.
more bravado you hear, the more likely they're, that they have no idea what they're talking about. So that's just generally speaking.
Yeah. Okay. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about is, I was going to say I think it depends on your experience, your life situation, etc., with how you respond. But I guess I've changed my mind since the conversation and think that it doesn't really matter what your experience is unless you're an armed law enforcement officer. And
That's their job.
Right. That's their
they
job.
They have to stay there. And deal
That's
with
their
that.
training.
Yeah.
That's their. But any idea that we would see initially, I was thinking like to have any kind of a civilized society, we would have to do or say something. But that wouldn't necessarily be true if that would cause somebody to get killed.
Right.
So
I'm walking by this guy who screams child molester with my family. My kids are there, my wife's there. He says something horrible, my children are there, so I turn around and start to lecture him, and I get close to him. Now I'm within arm's reach, the whole thing could escalate. He could be scared, I'm a big man. Yeah. He's obviously mentally ill. For all I know, he could be seeing 3 or 4 of me at the time, having a conversation with somebody completely different. Right. He's seeing Napoleon walk down the street. I don't know what's going on with him. Right? Seriously, he's hearing voices probably.
Yeah.
Other things are going on that I'm unaware of because he's in a different state of mind. So confronting him that way isn't helpful. It doesn't de-escalate the situation. The general rule, right, once you get past maturity, intelligence, and noticing what's going around is distance. If you control the distance, you control the engagement. If you control the distance, you control the fight. So if I see something that's a threat, and then like this guy on the train, you want to create distance. If you can't create distance, then you want to put something between you and that threat and grab a weapon. And only if you can't do that, and he engages with you or is about to, then you need to have to go hands-on. But and at that case, once you go hands-on, it's still about distance. Controlling the distance is how you control the fight, right? So somebody has a weapon. If we actually do have to defend ourselves against somebody with a weapon, it's about controlling distance, controlling the weapon arm, and that. But that's a last step. First thing you do is make distance between you and the threat, not close the distance.
So, is there anything else you want to add to this? And specifically, what would you say to people watching this or listening to this if they do encounter some kind of a situation, either in an open area where there's someone freaking out about whatever they're freaking out or saying horrible things to you, in a closed area like a train or a bus. That's why I think that this conversation ultimately is urgently needed. People need to learn about this as opposed to just kind of some knee-jerk moral reaction. I would do that. Is there anything that you would like to say that I haven't gotten to? Any question or any thought, any comment?
I think we have to, I'd like to reiterate those points that I don't want to judge people's actions. I could have been on that train and been angry and also, gotten in the guy's face. So we're using it as opposed to judging. In the same way, I also don't take too seriously people who say, I would have done this or I would have done that. Right. We use it as a lesson. 2, I'd like to reiterate to people just how dangerous knives are. And this incident kind of shows that. It's very, very important people understand how deadly knives can be. And 3, use your maturity and intelligence and best your senses during the incident and when you're confronted with somebody. And if it's clear to you that they might be mentally unstable or mentally ill, engaging with them, deterring them from attacking, trying to teach them a lesson, trying to reason with them about how they shouldn't say this or should say that is probably not the best idea. And in every case, if you feel like someone's a threat or something is a threat and you're not a law enforcement officer and it's not your job, you dial 911, but create distance between you and the threat. And distance with those you love from the threat. It only when you have to, can you engage physically? You don't have a right to go shove someone because they say something racist. Is it horrible that people say racist things to people or call people child molesters or call a woman a slut in the street? Of course. Does that mean you can go over and put your hands on them? No. And if they're mentally unstable, you're not even going to be teaching them a lesson. I mean, if it's someone that's truly mentally ill, you're just going to be escalating a situation that could very well turn out terrible, as we've seen in this particular situation.
I have one more question. I'm almost embarrassed to ask you this question, but it's been nagging at me. And when I tweeted or Facebooked or both that I was having a conversation with you, bizarrely, I received a ton of criticism. Oh, the bodies aren't even cold, and you shouldn't be having this conversation. How tasteless of you. It's such, rather than me give you my, articulate how bewildering I find that, what do you think about that? Is this some kind of inappropriate?
I think it's tasteless to jump on a situation especially when you don't know much about it. And because you hear a few details, use it for a political agenda. Now, there are people who are immediately going to say, well, what about Islam and terrorists and things like that? And yeah, if a bomb goes off tomorrow in London, I'm not going to immediately say, I'm sure it was an Islamic terrorist. I'd be lying to you if I said I'd be surprised. And I would wait until more details came out before I would attribute anything to it, because, you want to be smart about that kind of thing. And then post that event, you want to show as much respect as you can for the victims. But then you also have to analyze the situation and say, what can we do to keep ourselves safe, and what can law enforcement and what can we do?
It's a bizarre idea that somehow not talking about what people should do if they find themselves in a similar situation is somehow a virtue. I can't understand why, given that this sort of thing happened, by definition it just happened, right? Given that it happens, what good could possibly come about either for waiting a year or something, or not talking about it at all, given that other people inevitably will find themselves in similar situations? And isn't it better to be more informed about the decisions you make as opposed to ignorant, or just so morally motivated that you don't think about anything other than some hero, saving the women or the children? Or...
I think if people want to take anything away from this incident, which is a terrible tragedy because two men are dead, that's positive. The way to do that is to think about talking to your kids, talking to the people you love about what to do in a circumstance
Exactly.
where they might find themselves confronted by someone who's mentally ill and potentially violent, and how to deal with those sorts of situations. I think the thing that's not helpful is to immediately use it as a political football,
Right.
or blame
Which
the
is what we
president.
see.
Which is what we see, as vulgar as he
Independent
is.
of who the president is.
Yes.
Right.
Whether it was President Obama or President Trump,
Right.
to immediately throw that up on your Facebook page and start talking about whatever you think that means, that's not very helpful. But I do think it's good if you have children or people that you care about to sit them down and say, listen, if you're riding on the Max,
To have an honest conversation.
yes,
that
you're
this
riding
is
on the
reality.
Max train and you're going to school, you're going to PSU, and some mentally ill person or somebody sitting across from you starts screaming horrible things at you or someone else, what should you do?
Right.
You know, you want to create distance between you and the threat, dial 911. Right. There was a hero on that train, and he was the one that followed the attacker after he left the train and called the police, and that's how they were able to find him. He's a dangerous man, and they were able to find him because that person did the appropriate thing, which is he kept a distance and called law enforcement so that they could come and then take him into custody. Yeah. And so there are some lessons that can be drawn from it, and I think those lessons are important, and they're important to talk about for the people that you love and care about.
Ignoring it doesn't mean it's going to go away.
No.
It just means that you're going to make worse decisions.
Right, and my business is here, and that Max Stop is here, and I want my students to know, what is the right thing to do and what is the wrong thing to do as far as staying safe. So I think it's an important conversation to have.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.